I think the reason why most people can't stop thinking about money or obsess over money is because they haven't understood the psychological drivers behind why they're making the money decisions that they do. A lot of people have these like unconscious beliefs or like money scripts kind of running on autopilot in the background. Just bringing some awareness into why you have the emotions you have about money, why you're making the money decisions that you're making is the first step and honestly the key to breaking that cycle. You can't change what you don't recognize.
Do you think money takes up more life space than it should? On this show, we discuss with and share stories from artists, authors, entrepreneurs, and advisors about how they mindfully minimize the time and energy spent thinking about money. Join your host, Jonathan Dio, and learn how to put money in its place and get more out of life.
Hey, welcome back. On this episode of the Mindful Money Podcast, I'm chatting with Hanna Horvath. Hanna has a background as a financial journalist, has written over 1,000 articles on personal finance, making her, I think, an expert probably. Her approach focuses on helping people develop more intentional relationships with their finances that align with their true values rather than inherited beliefs or societal pressures. This resonates deeply with the Mindful Money listeners, so I appreciate you coming on as a guest. Hanna is a CFP who specializes in decoding the psychological forces driving our financial decisions. She's a managing editor of Bankrate, the website I've referenced for decades about savings and lending rates. I've pointed so many people to that website. I wanted to have her on the podcast because of her newsletter, Your Brain on Money, where she explores how unconscious scripts, cognitive biases, and emotional triggers shape our relationship with money. Hanna, welcome to the Mindful Money Podcast.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm excited to have this conversation. You listed a couple of episodes, so you sort of referenced a few people that you know out in the world. So I'm glad to add you to this list. Growing folks that are trying to align money thinking and our decisions together to sort of better living. Before we get into it, where do you call home? Where are you connecting from?
Yeah, I'm live in New York City, in Brooklyn.
Okay. Where'd you grow up?
I grew up in DC, so I've pretty much always lived in cities. Obviously, this is kind of the big city of America, but yeah, it's what I know.
It's what you know.
Yeah.
So growing up in big city, DC, and now in New York, what did you learn about money and entrepreneurship as like a kid?
Yeah, so I grew up in a very ambitious, very type A family. My educational background was in kind of a private school system, very academically rigorous system. And so I think from there, I internalized a lot of ideas about money as, a marker for success, kind of a way to prove yourself to other people, like a very easy qualitative way to kind of measure up against other people. But I think for me, that was something that I internalized very early. And that was something that really, especially at the very beginning of my career, I was very hyper focused on, kind of this idea of, I would call it like a wealth accumulator, just like this very compulsive saving, money making habits, taking all these types of different freelancing gigs, picking stuff up. And of course, my background or kind of my career was rooted in personal finance. So I really did know the kind of nuts and bolts of how to manage your money. But there was such a disconnect for me between what I knew about money and what I was actually doing with my money. And I think a really key point for me was I had this number in mind of, okay, when I reach this number in my, bank account, I'm going to feel great. I'll like have made it. And I remember reaching it and I'm like sitting in my apartment, kind of looking at my bank account and I'm like, oh, well, okay, now what? You know, and I think that for me was really the turning point of taking a step back from personal finance and thinking of it as less of a math problem and more of a behavioral problem, like a human problem. And that's kind of what has led me to where I am now with, writing a lot more about money psychology and that kind of stuff.
Where were you in the career when you sort of made this aha or had this aha moment?
Yeah. The full transition has been over the past couple of years. I would say it was about 5 years ago. And it was kind of twofold where I started to sort of take a step back and think more about the holistic issue of financial literacy because, it continues to be a big struggle for a lot of people. I think there's been a lot of brilliant minds kind of trying to solve the issue of financial literacy. And yet so many people continue to struggle. We're both in the financial advice business and there's probably never been more financial advice online, and yet people still struggle so much. So this had me thinking a lot about there's a disconnect, at least in my mind, between financial knowledge and financial behavior. And that's what kind of started pushing me more into money psychology and thinking more about how behavior drives so many of our regular decisions, but specifically money decisions. And so that's how I kind of made that shift.
Yeah. Thinking about like career track, what
Mhm.
led to financial journalism to begin with, and how did you end up at Bankrate?
Yeah. So I kind of fell into financial journalism. I was a journalism major in college and I graduated unemployed, like a lot of journalism majors do. And I was kind of looking for a job and I was freelancing at lots of different publications. And I honestly, the most regular work I was getting was from financial publications. And they often they had the best rates. So I kind of just started doing that more and more. And then I was like, oh, I kind of feel like I'm falling a little bit into a niche. And in my mind, I'm like, well, I don't know if this is what I'm interested in writing about, but at least it's helpful for my life. Like everybody kind of needs to know about money. At least, that was my thinking at the time. And just over the years, I got more and more engrossed in this idea of personal finance because it affects everyone. Every single person has to deal with it. And it's so personal. No one has the exact same personal finance situation. And I just found that so fascinating. And so the more I wrote about it, I realized, okay, I want to make sure I'm fully understanding what I'm writing about. So that's why I got my certified financial planning certification. So I could really feel like I knew kind of what I was writing about. And then from there, I just kind of slowly progressed throughout different financial media, going from freelancing to working full time at a couple places. And that's how I kind of ended up landing at Bankrate.
What led to starting your own newsletter?
Yeah. So I had so many things I wanted to write about, specifically around like money psychology and not just money psychology, but the kind of other piece of this. I think a lot of people look at financial literacy as an individual issue when
Mm.
there's a lot of structural and systemic barriers for financial wellness for a lot of people. And I felt like that wasn't written enough about. And I also hadn't really been given the opportunity to write about a lot of those topics. So I thought, well, why don't I kind of write about it on my own? And that was kind of the impetus behind that. And I've gotten such good feedback on it. And there seems to be a real hunger for this type of content. I mean, people I think are really starting to become interested in understanding, why they're making the money decisions they do, and also how their external environment affects their money.
Mm. Mm. You said something earlier that it never really dawned on me. I've never actually thought about this, but you said that the financial press or the financial publishers were actually paying a higher rate than other content. I wonder if that's good because there's so much crap out there in financial journalism. I guess 90% of it's garbage. So how do people tell the difference between good stuff and bad stuff?
Yeah, that's such a good question. And I think, it's only gotten exacerbated with social media. I think the internet and social media has democratized a lot of this information, which is great. But then that comes with a downside where kind of anybody can post about personal finance. And a lot of these algorithms reward sensationalism. Like, yeah.
I saw an Instagram, what do you call it, a reel today, and a guy was saying these are the only four funds or ETFs you need, and all four were like American. One was a broad market, one was the S&P, one was the Nasdaq. I'm like, this is all overlap. Like every single one of these, you own the same crap in every single one of these funds. Why would you recommend these? And it's just so much garbage. It's just so much just wrong-headed thought
I
so
know.
consistent. It drives me crazy. I mean, what do
I
you
know.
do? How do you advise people sift the garbage?
Yeah. So the first thing I'll say is if anybody is telling you anything definitively, like do this, invest in this, you should not be listening to them because they don't know you. They don't know your situation. They don't know. I mean, I always joke like the only acceptable financial advice answer is it depends because most of the people writing this content don't know you personally. That's why you engage with a financial advisor because they will understand your full financial picture and can give you that personalized advice. However, if you are online, just take everything with a grain of salt. Try to have a really good understanding of your own financial needs, like what you're looking for. And then you can kind of take information you read online and apply it to your situation in a way that makes sense for you. I think I'm talking more exclusively about financial influencers, but I guess it also applies even to sites like Bankrate. But where are they getting their money from? I think that's also something that is worth exploring, especially with financial influencers. Who is paying them? And that typically will show you where they're trying to kind of guide you, so to speak. And so just, yeah, being a little bit more discerning. I mean, so much of financial literacy at this point is media literacy for sure.
Wow. And there's no class in that, whatever. It's to each their own. Like you can't, good luck.
Yeah.
There's 1,000 different writers, there's 1,000 different podcasts. Good luck.
And what is even more sad, I guess, is, money is so emotional. It typically is associated with a lot of negative emotions. And so when people are in a very heightened emotional state, their ability to reason or just like fully kind of look into things, it just goes down. I mean, if you're feeling financially insecure, you're in a situation where you're, desperate, and someone's offering you a solution to kind of all your problems, you're going to be more likely to take it just because, you're in that position. And so I think a lot of times it can really prey on people's kind of vulnerabilities there.
Do you have like 2 or 3 favorite authors or podcasts that you listen to or write?
Yeah. The classic is Morgan Housel, who really,
Of course.
popularized the idea of money psychology. But to be perfectly honest, I read a lot more of just generic, it's not generic, but broader psychology books. And I think about, how they can relate. I mean, so much of my ideas for content or just the way I think about money comes from, stuff that's not even related to money, science books, fiction books, even just like navigating the world. I'm trying to remember the author. I just read a book, Carl Richards.
Yeah.
Those are probably the 2 money books that I recommend to people. I actually candidly don't, if somebody was asking me for financial book advice, I really wouldn't recommend like a straightforward finance book. I would recommend more of a psychology book, because again, a lot of times you'll read so much of financial advice is very prescriptive. It's like a checklist to follow. And you could know the complete ins and outs of like compound interest or like PE ratios. And if you don't understand your own behavior, you're not going to build anything that's sustainable or enjoyable. So that's kind of where I would guide people.
Yeah. I think I read this today. Jason Zweig just published his like list of 30 books that he would recommend. And so he's a great writer. He's written about personal finance forever, and he's listed like 30 different authors. So it was an awesome piece today.
Yeah.
Anyway, I wanted to talk about money across generations. I think my father, when I was like 9 or 10 years old, which is way too early to have this conversation, talked about my life timeline. Jonathan, what you're going to do, you're going to grow up, you're going to go to college, you're going to graduate, you're going to get married, you're going to have kids, you're going to work for 30 years, you're going to retire, this whole life timeline. I think financial planners think in this way. When we graduate into a different environment. And that matters a great deal. And I think across generations, if you graduate into a successful economy versus a rough economy like 2007, 2008, 2009, if you graduate at that time and you start at that period, you end up with a different sense of things. And things are getting more expensive. So how does our generation affect sort of the philosophy and the decisions we make?
Oh, yeah. I mean, it affects it. Something I write about a lot is how, the community that you're in, the time you're living in shapes your money behaviors. And a lot of that is, the generation that you're born into. And so it's exactly like you said, our money psychology, kind of our behaviors or these embedded beliefs we have about money typically kind of is shaped in childhood, but is also partially shaped in these kind of big life moments, like kind of coming into adulthood, graduating from college. And yeah, totally agree that, the economy at the time or kind of what was happening financially during that period of time can have a huge impact on how you perceive money, how you handle money. I mean, I was actually talking to somebody a couple of weeks ago who was a later stage millennial, graduated kind of right in that time frame that you said, and now is very successful, has millions of dollars, in the bank, and is so frugal because they still have that kind of ingrained fear of losing money that kind of came from working during a recession, struggling to find work. And so I think that causes a lot of tensions between generations, someone who's in an older generation saying, oh, just do this with your money. Well, that might not apply to the world that a younger person is living in. And so I think you see all these headlines of like, oh, baby boomers think Gen Z is lazy. And I always laugh at those because, it's just 2 completely different paradigms. I mean, they're living in essentially 2 completely different worlds when it comes to like how they're thinking about and behaving with money.
What are some of the differences? Like I know the baby boomer generation very, very well. How do millennials think about money that's different?
Millennials, it's interesting. It's kind of the same with Gen Z, where it's a huge cohort. And I would say there's those who really came of adulthood, during the recession, and those who are maybe still a little bit younger, they kind of feel in a different cohort. But I would say the disillusion of believing in the American dream, we see that with a lot of younger people, different types of like untraditional work structures, a lot more financial flexibility. A lot of millennials have been through multiple rounds of layoffs. I think they have a lot more internalized anxiety around stability. I think too, and this is a trend that I've written about a lot, what happens when traditional milestones are delayed financially? A lot of millennials are buying homes later, getting married later, having children later, and what that does to how you perceive the American dream, how you're using your money, so to speak. They're also more digitally natives, and that has completely shaped how they handle their money.
Yeah. Wow. That's a whole can of worms in and of itself. I mean, there was no social media when I came into the world, right? When I started working or anything like that. So nothing could lead me astray. And I feel like 90% of the stuff in social media leads you astray. So, you end up subject to all these potential pitfalls early on when you don't know how to judge the pitfalls. And I think that's a huge issue. You and I share sort of a deep philosophical stance. Like, money should occupy as little mental space as possible so we can focus on stuff that matters. So how does like becoming aware of our automatic financial reactions transform the relationship with money?
Yeah. So I think the reason why most people can't stop thinking about money or obsess over money is because they haven't understood the psychological drivers behind why they're making the money decisions that they do. And like I was saying before, a lot of people have these like unconscious beliefs or like money scripts kind of running on autopilot in the background. And they kind of keep you in this state of, low grade vigilance, essentially.
Give us an example of one of these money scripts. What is a money script?
Yeah, I can give you a personal example. I think a big one for me is, money equals status or money equals security. And for me, at least, that led me to engage in very like anxious behaviors, like checking my bank accounts multiple times a day. And again, it was like a self-soothing cycle where I would start to feel a little bit anxious about my financial situation. I would check all my bank accounts to reassure myself, like, okay, the money's there, it's not going anywhere. And that action was self-soothing, but ultimately unhelpful because I was just spending a lot of time obsessing and thinking about something that really wasn't changing that much hour to hour or really at all. So this is one example, like you said, of how it can take up so much brain space, and just bringing some awareness into why you have the emotions you have about money, why you're making the money decisions that you're making is the first step. And honestly, the key to breaking that kind of cycle. You can't change what you don't recognize, right? Yeah.
Yeah, awareness. That's like mindfulness. That's the first thing. That's what we're about.
Yeah.
Understanding the beginning. Well, so we grow up, we're sitting at the knees of our parents and grandparents, and we're learning these money lessons. What sort of unconscious beliefs do we take in when we're learning these money lessons from our parents and grandparents?
Yeah. So maybe not everybody had the conversation you had with your dad where they kind of lay out your entire
Yeah,
financial.
no one I've ever met has had that conversation.
But I think a lot of people don't realize, children pick up a lot. They pick up a lot indirectly, even unconsciously. They don't even realize what they're picking up. And so the way their parents are handling money, the way the parents talk to each other about money, what they're spending money on, all of that is internalized. And therefore, the child is kind of just told, like, oh, this is what money means. And it's not just the family, it's also, your school, your classmates, the community around you. I mean, just so much. All of that is part of that kind of forming that footprint, or that imprint rather, kind of in your brain of how money is perceived to you. And over time, it becomes extremely entangled in our identity and our sense of self, how we want other people to perceive us. And so it kind of makes sense why we can't stop thinking about money, or it takes up a lot of our mental space because we make it part of our value as a person. And so, like I was saying before, I think a lot of the things that, people can be taught about money at a young age is, that money can represent something like I was saying, status, freedom, safety. People can view it in a very negative light. Like if they lived in a household where they're constantly being told, well, we can't afford anything, or we can't afford this, they could potentially develop a scarcity mindset that, oh, I need to make sure I'm like hoarding my money or really keeping my money in the bank because it could be gone the next day. Or just kind of adopting a very like the person I was referring to earlier, a very frugal mindset, even when they have kind of leeway to be spending more. Those are just a couple examples.
It's very cultural. This whole
Yeah.
idea of money becoming something bigger than it really should be.
Yeah.
So in meditation, you have in order to set down some things, you have to pick up one thing. Like we use a focal point, usually our breath when we're meditating, and then stuff comes up and interrupts us. So I'm wondering if, in order to put down this belief that money is the answer, or that money equals status, or money equals freedom, or money equals what is the belief we should hold about money? Like what is the point of money then?
I would say that money is a tool to help you live the life you want to live. And more importantly, it's a tool to help you express your values. And I think what happens when you say, oh, money is freedom, money is safety, it's really you're trying to articulate your values. You're just kind of slotting money into that spot. And I think
Hmm.
for a lot of people, they have things that are really important to them, but a lot of times they're not really using their money in a way that kind of supports that. And so much I think of this entire exercise is getting really clear about what actually you care about, and then letting money kind of help you express those values, live that life you want to live, and setting up a framework where you can kind of make that happen kind of on autopilot. And when you set that framework up for yourself, you then don't have to kind of constantly be making decisions all day, every day. Like you were saying, kind of just like setting it aside, letting it kind of run on autopilot, making it easier for yourself.
So let's say you get there.
Mhm.
You're at this place where it's at the side, but you're still like reading and you're still engaged in media. And so how do you keep from being overwhelmed by all the messages that say do this or try this or do this differently or doing this wrong, or right? All the financial media that just says it's difficult to fight back. I might have a great plan, I might have a great idea, but then every day there's an onslaught of you're doing it wrong, you're doing it wrong, you're doing it
Yeah.
wrong. How do you fight back against that?
Couple things. I think the first thing is to understand yourself. If you understand yourself, what you care about, what's important to you, it's a lot easier to say, that is not me. That doesn't work for me.
Mm.
That doesn't work for, my life. Great example is I value flexibility in travel. I love to travel. It's a huge, part of something I enjoy spending money on. So for me, if someone's telling me to buy a piece of clothing, a new car, I'm like, no, no, no. I already know how I want to be spending my money. And it's very easy for me to kind of deflect and anything that's kind of not conflicting with how I want to be using my money or just what I care about. So I think it becomes easier when you do that. The second thing is create friction as much as possible. And there's kind of two pieces of this. One is we make like tens of thousands of decisions a day. We get decision fatigue. You're going to get tired at the end of the day. That's why you can't rely on willpower or discipline to kind of power through these types of things. I always give the example that I will never grocery shop if I'm hungry or tired, because I will just pile things into my cart. It's going to be double the cost. So just knowing that about yourself and setting up kind of guardrails like, okay, I know I need to grocery shop. I'm not hungry or tired right now. I just need to do it right now. I don't want to put it off because I don't want to, spend extra money. And then there's like, little tricks that you can do. Like I don't have like my credit card information saved in my computer. I have to physically like get up and go find my credit card. It's crazy, but even in those few seconds that it takes you to do that, it creates pause. It allows you just to have a little bit of friction so you can think to yourself like, do I really need this thing? And for big purchases too, like, you can set a dollar amount, okay, anything over $200, let's say, I'm going to wait 24 hours and just, I'm going to wait and then I'll see if I need it tomorrow. And if you still want it tomorrow, buy it. But a lot of times you're like, oh, I'm so glad I didn't buy that thing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Are there any financial tools you use? Like I know there's a lot of budgeting tools or tracking tools or anything like that that you find helpful.
Yeah, I don't. I'm so old school. I use a spreadsheet. But that actually has to do a lot with like just how I've had money anxiety. It just helps me feel more in control when I'm kind of managing the spreadsheet, so to speak. And I like kind of having that exercise of like going through my purchases, like looking at those patterns. But I think for a lot of people, they would benefit from using an app because they're so automated. They make it so easy to like see your spending habits. And that's why I think knowledge is power. And I understand a lot of people have, avoidance when it comes to wanting to check their bank accounts, but it's so important just to understand like where your money is coming and going. I mean, I actually hadn't been tracking my spending for a couple months once, and I went and looked and I was like, I cannot believe I'm spending this much money on, takeout. Like this is ridiculous. And it led to a very intentional action. So it's never fun, I think, to kind of have to think about this kind of stuff, but a lot of times it really leads to positive change for sure.
Yeah, yeah. There's this, well, and this may be because I'm in the industry, but I feel like the propensity of information out there in terms of financial press is about investing. And I
Hmm.
only think it's like 5 to 10% of people that ever get to that place. Like I think most people would benefit, 90% of people would benefit from just budgeting, cash flow tracking, setting goals, some very basic, simple stuff. But do you get the same sense?
Yeah, I get this. I do get the sense that, there's so much advice where it's like, oh, save, I don't know, a couple $100 a month and then you'll get here. And someone's like, well, I'm living paycheck to paycheck. There is this general frustration where it feels like so much of the advice falls flat for people because it doesn't take into account their lived experience and also a lot of the real societal issues that prevent a lot of people from being able to save, budget, etc. Something that always drives me nuts too about financial advice is the whole oh, just cut out those like little purchases, cut out the coffee, all this stuff. And it's like, that I live in New York, so like the lattes at this point are like $6 or $7. But that $6 or $7 latte, maybe you're going to a coffee shop, you have friends there. You're friends with the owners, you're getting that social connection. You're really participating in the community. That in my mind probably has so many more benefits than, something else. And cutting that out could actually have a pretty negative, outsized negative impact on your life beyond that, X amount of dollars saved each month. So that's why I really advocate for what do you care about? What's important to
Yep.
you first? And then that's when you can really identify where you can be cutting back and budgeting. And I think Ramit Sethi talks about this a lot. It's, a lot of times it's those big decisions, the big swings where you should be looking instead of kind of these little day-to-day purchases.
Like your rent, that you can make a big difference in some places with that kind of a decision.
Yeah.
So we both sort of advocate aligning spending with values, but I want to. There's so much noise, and we just talked about that. So what's something that's really simple, like one thing that a listener can do like today that will bring that alignment together, bring their spending more in line with their values.
Just think, what kind of life do I want to live? You know, if I had kind of unlimited funds, so to speak, what would I really be spending my money on? Or if money was really no object. And I think for a lot of people, it really wouldn't be material items. So I think once you kind of move past that point, maybe it's spending more time with your family. Maybe it's living closer to your friends. Maybe it's traveling more. And I think once you kind of get to that place, that's when you can think, oh, okay, well, how do I shift my spending to support that? Maybe you're spending $100 a month on streaming services. Maybe you could be using that money to do a monthly dinner with friends or something like that. And just shifting things around. And I think, again, I think the benefits of that vastly outweigh kind of the potential spending or cutbacks or anything like that.
It sounds like the first thing to do is to figure out what's important to you. It's
Yeah.
like to determine values, right?
That is a much more succinct way than than what I said.
So that's the to do. Then what's the one thing that listeners are probably already doing that they should maybe stop that would also
Mm.
lead to like spending values alignment?
I think a lot of people think that there's going to be a number, and I think a lot of people save and focus on a single number. But I think it's better to approach things with more flexibility. The goalpost is always going to be moving. Your needs are
Yep.
going to change. Your life is going to change. And so much of financial planning is actually building that resilience and building that adaptability because then that actually helps separate wealth from your identity. So then if you go through a big setback or even, get a windfall, it doesn't have this like huge impact on your sense of self that it otherwise might. And so I think that's something that I see. I'm giving two things, but lifestyle inflation. It is so hard. I understand it, but be very aware of how, you know, your spending habits change with your income because I think it's something that so many people fall into. And unfortunately, when we spend more, we get used to that. And then that becomes our new normal and it becomes even harder to cut back. Those are probably the two big things.
Yeah. Creep happens. There's no way to
Yeah.
avoid it. You got to pay real close attention. Happens to me all the time. So just for you to wrap up, what was the last thing you changed your mind about?
This kind of goes back to, the idea of a number. For the very beginning of my career, I was just kind of saving money, like I said. And I told myself, oh, I'm saving up to buy a house. Because I think I really convinced myself it's what everybody else is doing. It's like what to do. It means you're financially stable. That's kind of like the step. And actually within the past couple of months, I've kind of changed my mind on the idea of buying a house. I'm never say never, but I think for at least the foreseeable future, that's just probably something that I'm not going to do with my money. Part of the reason is just having more flexibility that comes with renting. Also, I live in New York. It's an expensive market, and there's a lot of costs that come with owning an apartment or a home in New York. So, you know, to me, it didn't feel like the best financial decision for myself. And also, I just didn't line up with the way I wanted to live my life. I travel a lot. I go to see my parents a lot. I just wanted that extra flexibility because that was really important to me. So it was something I had to kind of release myself from because, for a long time, I was telling myself, oh, this is what I'm saving for. And when I kind of decided not to really go through with it, I was like, oh, well, what do I do now? What am I really doing with my money now? And I kind of had to release myself a little bit from this idea that, I had to be kind of going towards this one goal, which is kind of instead think of money like, oh, I have this foundation to build on. I have this protection where I can make decisions and I have that flexibility. I have that freedom. So I kind of had to do a little bit of rewiring there.
Actually, it's very interesting because in the last probably 6, 8 months, I've heard many, many, many more financial professionals say something very similar. Maybe it's because the houses are so expensive. Maybe it's because earnings haven't kept up. Whatever the reason is why buy? So many people are saying buying's not worth it. It's too expensive. You got taxes, you got insurance, you got maintenance, you got all this stuff that comes with it. Why not just rent? Because rents have been held kind of back relative to the cost of buying.
Yeah, and I think too. I think a lot of it, it's a huge purchase. It's a very emotional decision, I think, for a lot of people because they envision like their lives in these kind of places. And I think a lot of people are also kind of fed into this idea that like, oh, it's this like investment, you're going to make all this money from it. And that's not to say you can't make money because you absolutely can make money, owning a home and selling a home. But I don't necessarily think that should be the end goal for most people buying a home with like the
Right.
expectation that you're going to make all this money doing it. And I think there are a lot of unforeseen costs that a lot of people don't realize until they kind of, go through the process. So yeah, for me, it
Absolutely.
just did not make sense.
Yep. And going back to your prior comment, you got to know your values first. And if your values
Yeah.
are travel and flexibility, that doesn't make sense. Like those two things don't go along.
Yeah. And
Yep.
and for me too, a huge value is just, my relationships being close to family. So, as my parents have gotten older, they've moved from DC to South Carolina. I want to make sure that I'm able to go spend time, like a couple months with them if I need to. And I think, if I owned a home, I would feel more, pressure to kind of stay put, so to speak.
Yeah. Is there anything people don't know about you, or maybe you've told them, but something that you really want them to know?
I don't know if it's what people don't know about me, but I always say, I am figuring this out in the same way that everybody else is figuring this out with money. There's no one solution, and what's worked for me is not going to work for somebody else, and that's why I really advocate, just be aware of yourself and your own behaviors, and take any advice I'm giving, take it with a grain of salt, like you would kind of with any other voice, and make sure it's applying to you and your situation. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah. And tell people how they connect with you. Where do they find your newsletter?
Yes. So my newsletter, Your Brain on Money. You can find it on Substack. I post pretty regularly on social media. It's the same username, Your Brain on Money. You can find me on kind of all social platforms there.
Are you writing the book, Your Brain on Money?
Maybe one day. I don't want to rule it out, but I think between the newsletter and the full-time job, but I hopefully one day in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Well, good luck. And thanks so much for coming on the Mindful Money podcast.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Yeah.
Thanks for listening. Full show notes for each episode, which includes a summary, key takeaways, quotes, and any resources mentioned, are available at mindful.money. Be sure to follow and subscribe wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. And if you're enjoying the content and getting value from these episodes, please leave us a rating and review at ratethispodcast.com/mindfulmoney. We'll be sure to read those out on future episodes.